Hello, this thing on. Okay. Video here goes nothing. So you got 99 over here today. And hold on. Okay. Oh shit. Yeah, whatever. Today we're gonna start reading Being in Nothingness again and yeah. Okay, ready. Chapter 2, Bad Faith. Uh Bad faith and lies. A human being is not the only being whom negativities are disclosed in the world. It is also the being that can adopt negative attitudes in relation to itself. In our introduction, we defined consciousness as a being for whom, in its being, there is a question of its being, insofar as this being implies a being other than itself. Translator's Note 1. Sartre here repeats verbatim his sentence from the French version of Being in Nothingness, page 29. I think it's like Etre didnt. But now we have elucidated the activity of questioning. We know that our formulation can also be expressed thus. Consciousness is a being for whom in its being there is a consciousness of the nothingness of its being. In the case of a prohibition or a veto, for example, the human being negates some future transcendence, but this negation is not a constative. My consciousness is not limited to merely envisaging a negativity. It constitutes itself in its flesh as the annihilation of a possibility projected by some other human reality as its possibility. To do that, it must arise in the world as a no. And indeed, it is as a no that the slave initially grasps his master, and as a no that the prisoner who is trying to escape grasps the sentry watching over him. There are even some men, guards, superiors, jailers, etc., whose social reality is uniquely that of a no, who will live and die without ever having been anything but a no. So I guess what he's trying to say is that some people exist to be a negation, kind of. Like a security guard, how a security guard stops you from robbing places, or how a prison guard stops the prisoners from escaping. Yeah, and the slave and master thing, I guess he meant it literally. Okay, anyway. Others who bear this no within their very subjectivity are equally constituted in their human person as a constant negation. No is the meaning. Okay, hold on. Can I move this a little bit? Yeah. No is the meaning and function of Schiller's Man of Resentment, Part 2, or Translator Note 2. Oh, since it's a new chapter, the translator notes got reset. Max Scheler, 1978 to 1929, was a German phenomenologist. His famous essay on resentment is translated into English as Scheler 2003. Okay, can I look this up? Okay. Man of Resentment, Scheller. Both respected and neglected. Reading recommendation, Life Philosophy Guy. Okay, I will read your Substack. Moralist Wertiel, Das Resentiment. Aufbau der Moralen, resentment of the construction of morality. Thinks he's onto something, but he makes too many sweeping claims. Christian morality, la la la, blah blah blah. You previously read this. Come and talk to me. No, 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 no. Okay. Anyway, so that's something fun you can read if you want to. Let's get back to it. And there are subtler attitudes such as irony, whose description would take us further into the intimacy of consciousness. In the case of irony, man annihilates, in the unity of a single act, what he advances. He makes you believe something in order not to be believed. He affirms in order to negate, and he negates in order to affirm. And he creates a positive object whose being, however, is nothing more than its nothingness. These attitudes of negation in relation to oneself therefore enable us to raise a new question. What must man be in his being for it to be possible for him to negate himself? Well, we ought to take the attitude of self-negation as universal. The kinds of behavior we can classify under this heading are too diverse. We would run the risk of dealing only with their abstract form. We choose and examine a specific attitude essential to human reality, and in which, at the same time, consciousness, instead of directing its negation outwards, turns it against itself. It seemed to us that this attitude must be bad faith. Bad faith is often assimilated to lying. We must indifferently say that someone is exhibiting bad faith or that he is lying to himself. Here we are willing to allow that bad faith consists in lying to oneself, on condition that lying to oneself is immediately distinguished from lying to court. We can agree that lying is a negative attitude, but this negation does not bear on consciousness itself. It aims only at something transcendent. Indeed, the essence of the lie implies that the liar is fully aware of the truth he is disguising. We must not lie about something we do not know about, or we do not lie about something we do not know about. We do not lie in broadcasting a mistake of which one is oneself a victim. We do not lie when we get something wrong. The ideal of the liar is then a cynic in his own consciousness who affirms the truth in itself and negates it in his words, while negating this negation for himself. Now, the targets of this doubly negative attitude are transcendent. The stated fact is transcendent since it does not exist, and the first negation applies to a truth, that is, to a specific transcendent type. As to the inner negation which I carry out correlatively to my affirmation of the truth for myself, that is applied to words, that is, to an event of the world. In addition, the liar's internal disposition is positive. It might be made the object of an affirmative judgment. The liar intends to deceive, and he does not seek to hide this intention or to mark the translucency of consciousness. On the contrary, when the need arises to decide on his secondary modes of behavior, he draws on this intuition. It explicitly exercises a regulative control over his attitudes. As to his advertised intention to tell the truth, I do not want to deceive you. That is true. I swear to it, etc. It is, of course, the object of a inner negation. At the same time, the liar does not recognize it as his intention. Hold on, I gotta move this a little more. I'll go over. Is that better? Yeah, that's good. Is performed But at the same time, the liar does not recognize it as his intention. It is performed or rehearsed. It is the intention of the character he is playing in full sight of his interlocutor. This character, precisely because he is not, is transcendent. In this way, a lie does not engage the internal structure of present consciousness. All its constitutive negations apply to objects that are accordingly expelled from consciousness. A lie, therefore, requires no special ontological foundation, and the explanations required for the existence of negation in general remain valid without needing to be changed. In the case of deception, doubtless what we have defined here is an ideal lie. It happens quite frequently. Probably that the liar is to a greater or lesser extent a victim of his lie. He is half persuaded by it, but these common and everyday forms of lies are also bastardized versions which represent a halfway house between lying and bad faith. The lie is a behavior that involves transcendence. But that is because the lie is an ordinary phenomenon within what Heidegger calls Mitziehen. Footnote 3. Heidegger uses the German term Mitziehen, which translates render as being with, to the result of the sociality of Dasein's existence. It presupposes my existence, the existence of another, my existence for another, and another's existence for me. Thus, we have no difficulty in conceiving that the liar must undertake the project of his lie in full lucidity, that he must have at his disposal a full understanding of his lie and the truth he is altering. It is sufficient that a principle of opacity should mask his intentions to the other, sufficient that the other should be able to take the lie for the truth. Through the lie, consciousness affirms that it exists in its nature as hidden from the other. It makes a profitable use of the ontological duality between my own self and the other's self. Hold on, I can't help myself but to look where the next damn chapter is. It's in like 3 pages. It's in 6 pages. That's okay. The situation cannot be the same for bad faith. If the latter really is, as we have said, a lie to oneself, of course for the person exercising bad faith, it is still a matter of covering up an unpleasant truth or of presenting some pleasant error as the truth. In appearance, therefore, bad faith has the structure of a lie. But what changes everything is that in bad faith, it is from myself that I am concealing the truth. Thus, the duality of deceiver and deceived is not present here. On the contrary, bad faith implies in its essence the unity of a single consciousness. That does not mean it cannot be conditioned by Mitziehen, as how, moreover, all the phenomena of human reality are. But Mitsein, maybe it's Mitsein, because I don't know, can solicit bad faith only by presenting itself as a solution that bad faith is able to surpass. Bad faith does not come to human reality from outside. Bad faith is not undergone, nor does it infect us, nor is it a state. But consciousness itself takes on its bad faith. This requires an initial intention and a project of bad faith. This project implies an understanding of bad faith as such and a pre-reflexive grasp of consciousness as performing its bad faith. From this it follows first that the person to whom one is lying and the person who is lying are one and the same person, which means that I must know, insofar as I am the deceiver, the truth that is hidden from me insofar as I am deceived. Better still, I must know this truth very precisely in order to hide it all the more carefully from myself. and this must not occur at two different moments within temporality, which I think that means time, which might as a stretch reestablish an appearance of duality, but within the unitary structure of a single project. Hold on, I need to blow my nose. Give me a sec. Okay, that's better. What's he talking about here insofar as the deceiver? The truth that is hidden from me insofar as I am deceived. Better still, I must know this truth very precisely in order to hide it all the more carefully from myself. This must not occur at two different moments within temporality, but within the unitary structure of a second project. Then how can the lie survive if its conditioning duality is abolished? Question mark. To this difficulty we can add another, depriving from consciousness its total translucency. A person who espouses bad faith must be conscious of his bad faith, because the being of consciousness is a consciousness of being. It seems that then that I must be in good faith, at least insofar as I am conscious of my bad faith, but that would annihilate the entire psychological system. Nothing will dispute, indeed, that if I deliberately and cynically attempt to lie to myself, I must completely fail in this undertaking. The lie recedes and collapses before our eyes. It is ruined from behind. By the very consciousness of lying to myself, that constitutes itself pitilessly before my project. As its very condition, the phenomenon in this case is evanescent, existing only in and through its self-definition. Of course, such phenomena is common. And we see, in fact, that evanescence belongs to bad faith. Yeah, can I look up what that means again? I remember looking up yesterday, or 2 days ago or whatever, but I already forgot. Okay, and I forgot to look up evanescence. That was on my bank account. Disappear or vanish. Okay. Disappearing or vanishing belongs to bad faith. It is evident that bad faith oscillates constantly between good faith and cynicism. Nevertheless, if the existence of bad faith is highly precarious, if it belongs to the category of psychological structures that can be described as metastable, it is no less the case that presents us with an autonomous and durable form of it. For a very number of people, it can even be the normal aspect of life. One can live in bad faith. This does not mean there are no sudden awakenings of cynicism or good faith, but it implies a constant and distinctive style of life. We seem to be in an extremely difficult position, being neither able to reject nor to understand bad faith. In order to escape these difficulties, many people blithely resort to the unconscious. In psychoanalytic interpretation, for example, the hypothesis of a censor will be used, conceived of a demarcation line with its customs, passport services, currency control, etc., to reestablish the duality between deceiver and deceived. Here, to the representative of reality is instinct. Alternatively, the primary drives and complexes of drives constituted by our individual history. An instinct is neither true nor false, because it does not exist for itself. simply exists. It simply is, exactly like this table, which is neither true nor false in itself, but simply real. This table is real, which I can agree with that. As for the conscious symbolizations of instinct, they should be construed not as appearances, but as real psychological facts. A phobia, a slip of the tongue, a dream, these really exist as concrete facts of consciousness. In the same way as the liar's words and attitudes are material ways of behaving, and really exist. Only the subject stands before these phenomena like a deceived person, in reality to the behavior of his deceiver. He observes them in his reality, and he has to interpret them. There is a truth to the deceiver's behavior. If the deceived person could relate it to the deceiver's situation and to his lying project, it would become integral parts of the truth, accounted for as lying behavior. Similarly, there is a truth to symbolic actions. It is what the psychoanalyst uncovers when he links them to the patient's historical situation, to the unconscious complexes that they express, to the barrier of censorship. Thus, the subject is wrong about the meaning of his behavior. He grasps it as it concretely exists, but not in its truth. Because he is unable to derive it from an initial situation and psychological constitution that remain unknown to him. The fact is that by means of the distinction between the id and the ego, Freud split the totality of the psyche in two. I was quoting Freud. But no 4. Nice, so let me get some water. Okay. Okay, let's look at footnote 4. Although Sartre uses the French term ça and moi, I followed the convention of English of using the Latin words to translate Freud's term for these parts of the mind. Okay. I'm ego, but I am not id. My position in relation to my non-conscious psyche is in no way privileged. I am my own psychological phenomena insofar as I ascertain them in their conscious reality. For example, I am the drive to steal this or that book from this display. I'm one with it. I throw light on it, library in a reference, and I resolve to commit my theft in accordance with it. But I am not these psychological facts insofar as I passively undergo them, and I am obliged to hypothesize about their origin and their true meaning. Just as an expert conjectures about the nature and essence of some external phenomenon, this theft, for example, which I may interpret it as an impulse immediately dictated by the scarcity, the interest or the price of the volume I'm about to steal is a truth in process deriving from my need for punishment, which can be related more or less directly to an Oedipus complex. Isn't that the one where you're attracted to your own mother? Or how could those be related? Whatever. Now I need to go read Freud. I don't know. The thing about these philosophy books is like once you read one of them, you gotta go read all of them, so you can get the context of like what these people are referencing, which is kind of annoying, but also what I enjoy. I enjoy like my world being expanded, like the expansion of the mind or whatever. Like you literally get more knowledge and more ways to get more knowledge. The more knowledge you get, it's like a well, it's not paradox, but it's just cool. Anyway, only this to be reached only by the hypotheses that are more or less probable. The criterion of the truth will be the extent of the psychological facts it can explain from a more pragmatic point of view. It will also be the success of the psychiatric cure it enables. Finally, the discovery of the truth requires the assistance of the psychoanalyst, who appears as the mediator before my unconscious inclinations and my conscious life. The other appears as the only person able to carry out a synthesis between the unconscious thesis and the unconscious antithesis, or antithesis. I can only know myself through the mediation of the other, which means that I am in relation to my id, in the position of the other. If I have some notion of psychoanalysis, I can try, if circumstances are propitious, to analyze myself, to psychoanalyze myself. But this attempt can only succeed if I mistrust any kind of intuition and apply to my own case from outside abstract schemas and the rules I have learned. As for the results, whether they are gained by my own efforts or with the assistance of a technician, they will never enjoy the certainty conferred by intuition. They will merely have the ever-increasing probability of a scientific hypothesis. Of scientific hypotheses. The hypothesis of the Oedipus complex, like the atomic hypothesis, is nothing but an experimental idea, as Peirce says. It cannot be distinguished from the set of experiments that allow us to perform and the effects it enables us to predict. In this way, psychoanalysis substitutes the notion of bad faith with the idea of a lie without a liar. It allows us to understand not how I am able to lie to myself, but how I can be lied to, since it places me in relation to myself in the situation of the other's relation to me. It represents the duality of deceiver and deceived, an essential condition of the lie. With a duality of id and ego, it introduces me to the depths of my subjectivity and intersubjective structure of mid-scene. Are these explanations satisfactory? Are you asking me? No, not really, bro. I'm kind of getting confused. I don't know. It's like you can lie and you can be lied to. You can lie to yourself and you can lie to other people. But it's like, are you conscious of your lying? Yeah, you are actually. Or is it like you just unconsciously lie to yourself? Like somehow some people fall into like a delusion, or I guess like if you think about it, like if you have like schizophrenia or something, are you just like lying to yourself over and over again because it's not really there? Your brain just like lies to itself. But anyway, basically this means I don't know anything, so whatever. Let's keep reading. Examined more closely, psychoanalytic theory applies less simple than at first sight. It is not quite right to say that the id functions like a thing in relation to the psychoanalyst hypothesis, because it is a thing indifferent to the conjectures we make about, and the id, on the contrary, is touched by them as they approach nearer to the truth. Indeed, Freud draws attention to resistances when, at the end of the first period, the doctor approaches the truth. The resistances are instances of objective behavior, apprehended from an external point of view. A patient shows signs of suspicion, refuses to speak, gives far-fetched accounts of his dreams, and sometimes even removes himself completely from psychoanalytic treatment. We may nevertheless inquire which part of the patient can resist in this way. It cannot be the ego, understood as the totality of psychological facts in consciousness. The ego could hardly support the psychiatrist in reaching his goal, since its position in relation to the meaning of its own reactions is exactly that of the psychiatrist himself. The most I can do is to objectively assess the degree of possibility of the hypotheses that have been advanced, as a witness of the psychoanalysis might do, and accordingly the extent of subjective facts they can explain, and if it seems to him that this probability verges on certainty, this ought not to cause him distress. Most of the time it is he who has committed himself through a conscious decision to the path of psychoanalytical therapy. Should we say that the patient is worried by the psychoanalyst's daily revelations and tries to escape them, even while he acts in his own eyes as he wishes to continue treatment? In that case, we no longer appeal to the unconscious to explain bad faith. It is out there, in full consciousness, with all its contradictions. In any case, that is not how the psychoanalyst intends to explain these resistances. In his view, they are deep and hidden, and their source is distant. They are rooted in the very thing we are trying to elucidate. However, it is equally impossible for the resistances to stem from the complex to be revealed. This complex, as such, will tend rather to collaborate with the psychoanalyst, since it seeks to express itself in clear consciousness, to trick the censor and get around it. The subject's refusal can be located only at the level of censor. It alone is able to apprehend the psychoanalyst's questions or revelations as approaching, more or less closely. Sorry, it's a burp. Real loud. Just weird because the only thing I had for dinner, I guess, it was an apple. An apple. That was the only thing I ate. So later I'm probably gonna get hungry and go eat some chips, which will result in a like 1 hour break. Anyway, the drivers in reality, it is trying to repress it alone because it alone knows what it is repressing. If in fact we subject the reifying language and mythology of psychoanalysis, we will see that in order to pursue its activity discerningly, a censor must be acquired with what it represents. Indeed, if we abandon all those metaphors that represent repression as a clash of blind forces, we will be obliged to acknowledge that the censor must choose, and in order to choose, it has to represent itself. How else could it happen otherwise that the censor allows permissible sexual drives through and tolerates the clear expression in consciousness of needs, hunger, thirst, sleep? And how can we explain its ability to relax its surveillance, or how the disguises of instincts can even deceive it? But it is not sufficient for the censor to discern the condemned drives. It has to apprehend them further as to be repressed, which implies at the least some representation on its own part of its own activity. In brief, how could the censor discern the drives to be repressed without being conscious of discerning them? Can we conceive that knowledge as being ignorant of itself? To know is to know that one knows, Elaine said. We should say instead, all knowing is conscious of knowing. Thus the patient's resistances imply at the level of the censor a representation to be repressed as such. An understanding of the goal which the psychoanalyst questions are leading, and an act of synthetic combination, by means of it which compares the truth of the repressed complex to the psychoanalytic hypothesis directed on it, and of these various operations imply in turn that the censor is conscious of itself. Well, what kind of consciousness of itself can the censor have? It must be conscious of being conscious of the drive to be repressed. But precisely in order not to be conscious of it, what is there left to say other than the censor must be in bad faith? We have gained nothing from psychoanalysis, since in order to eliminate bad faith, it installs between the unconscious and the conscious mind as an autonomous conscience in bad faith. The fact is that its attempt to establish a genuine duality and even a trinity, id, ego, superego, expressing itself through the censor, amounts to no more than a verbal terminology. The very essence of the reflexive idea of hiding something from oneself implies the unity of a single psyche and consequently a double activity in the heart of unity, tending on the one hand to maintain and to notice the thing to be hidden, and on the other to push it away and to veil it. Each of the two aspects in this activity complements the other. That is, each implies the other in its own being. In separating by the means of the censor the conscious from the unconscious, psychoanalysis has not succeeded in dissociating the two phases of the act. Hold on, let me go back down. Because the libido is a blind conatus between conscious expression, and the conscious phenomenon is a passive and rigged result. It is merely located this twofold activity of repulsion and attraction at the level of the sensor. Moreover, in order to take account of the unity of the total phenomenon, the repression of the drive that disguises itself and get past in symbolic form, we still need to establish that some comprehensible connections between its different moments. How can the repressed drive disguise itself if it does not encompass one, the consciousness of being repressed, two, the consciousness of having been driven back because it is what it is, and three, a project of disguise? I mean, this guy keeps talking about repression and the negation of the truth. It's like if you repress like a bad memory, it's gonna be like you never knew about it, right? So it's like it never even existed. I think that's what he might be getting at. Maybe not though. Hold on. Also, I have to check my NGU idle blood magic. I'm almost ready to rebirth, to be honest. Hold on. Yeah, I'm basically ready to rebirth. Whatever, hold on. Where was I? Libido, a project of disguise. No mechanistic theory of condensation or transference can explain these changes affected in the drive by itself, because any description of the process of disguise implies a veiled appeal to finality. And similarly, how are we to take the account of the pleasure of anguish accompanying the drive's symbolic and conscious satisfaction? Consciousness does not include, beyond the sensor's reach, an obscure understanding of the goal to be reached, insofar as it is simultaneously desired and forbidden. Having rejected the conscious unity of the psyche, Freud is obliged to hint throughout at a magical unity linking phenomena together, across distances and through obstacles, as the primitive practice of participation brings together the person placed under a spell with the wax figure fashioned in his image. Through participation, the unconscious trieb takes on the characteristics of being repressed or damned, which spreads through it, colors it, and magically provokes its symbolizations. And similarly, the consciousness phenomenon is entirely colored by its symbolic meaning, even though it cannot grasp this meaning by itself and in clear consciousness. But in addition to its inferiority in principle and the explanation that magic does not abolish the coexistence, so I forgot to check footnote 5. Did I read this already? Trieb. The German word Trieb, which features in Freud's writing, is translated as drive. At the unconscious stage, the stage of censorship, and the conscious stage, of two contradictory and complementary structures, each of which reciprocally implies and destroys the other. That faith has hypostasized and thingified. 6, but it cannot be avoided. 6, translators note 6. Choisifie la mauvaise foi. See my notes on choisifier on my notes of the translation here. Sartre's scarce quotes have led me to follow his emphasis on the novelty of the verb by using the thingify. And let me look up hypostasize. I think if like stasis is like to freeze something, but I don't know what hypostasis, like super freeze. Hypostasize. To treat or represent something as a abstract reality. Not gonna lie, when Google shows like the God It's like how when this word was used and they go from 1800s, like how did they even figure out how many times they use the word in the 1800s? Like I'm sure it's like an estimation, but like damn. Like why the hell are you going back to 1800s? Anyway, sorry, I'm watching a TikTok of a guy petting a porcupine. Teacher just be hating. Okay. Unconscious stage of censorship and the conscious stage of two contradictory and complementary structures, each of which reciprocally implies and destroys the other. Hypothesize, hypostasized. I didn't even fucking figure out what it meant. I just went on TikTok. Okay, whatever. But it has not been avoided. This is what prompted the Viennese psychiatrist Steckel to disobey psychoanalytic doctrine and write in La Femme Frigide. I mean the frigid women. Let's go footnote 7. Wilhelm Steckel was an Austrian doctor and psychologist. Initially a follower of Freud, he came to disagree with several aspects of Freud's theory. The English translation is of the book is quoted by Sartre as Steckel in 1953. Whenever I have been able to advance far enough in my investigations, I have observed the kernel of the psychosis was conscious, and moreover the cases that he reports in his work testify to a psychological bad faith that Freudianism is unable to account for the cases. For example, of women whose disappointment in marriage has made them frigid, which is to say that they manage to conceal from themselves the pleasure they receive from the sexual act. Note in the first place that for these women it is not a matter of hiding complexes from themselves that are deeply buried in semi-physiological darkness, but rather than of an objectively detectable activity that they cannot fail to register at the moment they perform it. Frequently, indeed, the husband reveals to Stickel that his wife has shown objective signs of pleasure, and it is these signs that the wife, when questioned, fiercely endeavors to deny. What the hell? Where are we going with this? Actually, I look, know where they're going anyway. Pause. Okay, anyway. What we have here is an activity of distraction. Similarly, we learn from the confessions elicited by Stickel that these pathologically frigid women try to distract themselves in advance from the pleasure they fear. Many of them, for example, at the moment of the sexual act, divert their thoughts towards their daily occupation and go through their household accounts. We would want to speak here of the unconscious. However, if the frigid woman distracts her consciousness in the way from the pleasure she experiences, she does not do so cynically and in full agreement with herself. It is in order to prove to herself she is frigid. The phenomenon here is clearly a case of bad faith, since the effort made to dissociate the felt pleasure implies a recognition that the pleasure is felt and implies it precisely in order to deny it, but we are no longer in the territory of psychoanalysis. Thus, the explanation of the unconscious by virtue, on the one hand, is severing the unity of the psyche. One cannot take account of the facts that at first sight seem to depend on that unity, and on the other hand, there is an infinite number of ways of behaving in bad faith that explicitly contradict this type of explanation, because their essence implies that they can appear only with the translucency of consciousness. We find ourselves back with the problem still intact that we were trying to elude. So I guess that what the guy's trying to say is that when women are in a bad marriage and guys have sex with them, they pretend not to enjoy it or something like that, or like they do enjoy it, but they just want to show like the husband that they're dissatisfied. Oh, so that's why my wife doesn't enjoy it. No, I'm kidding. I don't have a wife. Anyway, that was kind of interesting. It's also kind of freaky, but whatever. Also, I need to go blow my nose and drink some water, so and use a bathroom, so I'll be right back. Let's hit the pause button on this. Okay, we're back. We are so back. Okay, let's read the next section then. Actually, how many pages are the next section? It was 113. Yeah, we might have to stop here. Like, on the next one, actually. I'm not gonna lie, I might even be able to do the whole chapter tonight. And after that, I guess I'm gonna go on some TikTok, and then I might have to start studying on stream. Fuck me, bruh. I really don't want to do that. Okay, forms of bad faith. Translator note A. The French section heading is Les conduites de mauvaise foi. I'm avoiding the plural behaviors. I've settled here for forms. 113 pages is like 20 pages. Maybe not. 20 pages is like an hour and a half. Anyway, if we wish to resolve this difficulty, we ought to take a closer look at the forms of bad faith and attempt to describe them. This description may allow us to delineate more sharply bad faith's condition of possibility. That is, to answer the question from which we set out, what must man be in his being if he is capable of bad faith? Let us take, for example, this woman who arrived at a first meeting. She knows full well the intentions entertained in relation to her by the man speaking to her. She also knows that sooner or later she will have to make a decision. But she does not want to feel its urgency. She takes account of the respectful and discreet aspects of her partner's attitude. She does not see his behavior as an attempt to make the so-called opening moves. In other words, she does not want to see the possibilities of development over time that his behavior presents. She confines his activity to what is in the present and has no wish to read in the sentence he addresses to her anything but their explicit meaning. If he says, I admire you so much, she strips the sentence of its sexual background. She attaches immediate meanings, envisaged as objective properties, to her interlocutor's sayings and actions. The man speaking to her appears to be as sincere and respectful in the way a table is round or square, or a wall hanging blue or gray. And the properties she hereby attaches to the person to whom she is listening are therefore frozen in a thing-like permanence, which is nothing but the projection into the flow of time of their strict present. The fact is that she is not aware of her wish. She keenly perceives the desire she inspires, but a cruel, naked desire would humiliate and horrify her. However, she would find no charm in an attitude of respect that was nothing but respect. To satisfy her, she requires a feeling addressed to the whole of her person, that is, to the whole of her freedom and in recognition of her freedom. But at the same time, this feeling must be entirely one of desire, that is, it must address her body as an object. On this occasion, therefore, she refuses to see the desire for what it is, and does not even give it a name. She recognizes it only to the degree to which it is transcended into admiration, esteem, respect, and entirely absorbed within the more elevated formations it produces, to the point where it no longer figures except as a sort of density and heat. But now he takes her hand. This action by her interlocutor threatens to change the situation by calling for an immediate decision, to leave her hand there as if to consent herself and to the flirtation it commits her. To withdraw is to disrupt the vague and unstable harmony that gave the moment its charm. The moment of decision needs to be deferred for as long as possible. We know what happens now. The young woman leaves her hand where it is. But she does not notice she has left it there. She does not notice because it turns out by chance that she is, at that moment, pure spirit. She takes her interlocutor right to the most elevated region of sentimental speculation. She talks about life, her life, and shows herself in her most essential aspect, as a person, a consciousness, and while she does this, the divorce of her body from soul is accomplished. Her hand rests there, inert between the hot hands of her partner, neither consenting nor resisting, a thing. So I don't really know what he's trying to say here, but it's like, according to him, it's like a woman kind of like thinks, you know, kind of delays the decision to the very last moment to accept the flirtation or deny it, and it's like he kind of has some kind of, what's it called, cognitive dissonance. That's like, oh, he thinks of me in this good way, but he's not actually trying to fuck me, but the guy is low-key trying to fuck her. At least what that is what I think, but low-key might be fucked in the head. Oh, hey Cloister, how's it going? uh yeah, nothing much is up. I'm just doing some reading. So when no one's here, am I basically talking to myself? Yeah, basically. It's a problem. The book I'm reading is Being and Nothingness. Yeah. I can't really expect people to be here all the time, so yeah, I spend the time listening to my own voice. And I like the sound of my own voice, to be honest. Maybe that's a little conceited of me to say. But yeah, it's basically a book about philosophy and existentialism, and about how I don't know, about how human action is, if human action is really a conscious decision or if it's not. At least that's what I think. Anyway, let's continue reading. We will say that this woman is in bad faith, but we can see at once that she makes use of more than one method to maintain herself in this bad faith. She has disarmed her partner's actions in reducing them to being only what they are, that is, to existing in the mode of the in itself. But she allows herself to enjoy his desire, to the extent that she apprehends it as not being what it is, that is, to the extent that she recognizes its transcendence. Finally, at the same time, she keenly senses her own body's presence, perhaps to the point of being aroused. She actualizes herself as not being her own body, and she contemplates it from a height as an passive object to which things might happen. Yeah, you kind of got here at a freaky chapter in the book, but which can neither provoke them nor avoid them, because all its possibilities lie outside it. What unites these various aspects of bad faith? It is a certain act of forming contradictory concepts. That is, concepts in which an idea and the negation of the idea are united. The underlying concept generated in this way makes use of the twofold property of human beings, a being a facticity and a transcendence. These two aspects of human reality are, in truth, anatomy, capable of being validly coordinated, but bad faith does not want you to coordinate them, or to resolve them as means of a synthesis. From its point of view, it is a matter of affirming their identity, even while preserving their differences. Facticity must be affirmed as being transcendence, and transcendence as being facticity, in a way that allows us, at the moment we apprehend one of them, to find ourselves suddenly faced with the other. The prototypical formula of bad faith can be found in certain famous phrases that are modeled. In order to produce their effects on the spirit of bad faith, we are familiar, for example, with this title of one of Jacques Chardon's work, Love is Far More Than Love. Footnote 9. Footnote 9. So let's go read the ninth footnote. Jacques Chardon, 1884 to 1968, was a French novelist. The novel by him, to which Sartre reflects L'amour c'est beaucoup plus L'Amour was published in 1937. No English translation exists. Okay. Here we can see how love as is present in its facticity, the contact of two skins, sensuality, egoism, Prostruan's workings of jealousy, Adlerian's struggle of the sexes, etc., is put together with love as transcendence. Mauriac's River of Fire, the call of the infinite, Plato's Eros, Lawrence's murmurings, cosmic intuition, etc. In this case, we start out from facticity to find ourselves suddenly, beyond the present and man's factual being, beyond the psychological, right at the heart of metaphysics. In contrast to this title of a play by Sarment, I Am Too Big for Myself, footnote 10, which also displays the characteristics of bad faith, begins by throwing us straight into the transcendence in order to imprison us suddenly within the narrow limits of our de facto essence. Okay, let's go look at footnote 10. I'm too big for myself. Jean Sarment, 1897 to 1976, was a French actor and a writer. The play by him to which Sartre refers, Je suis trop grand pour moi, was written in 1924. No English translation exists. Okay. He has become what he was, or in its equally famous counterpart, he said as into himself as a last eternity changes him. 11. 11 translator notes, tel quel le même enfant l'éternité le change. Sartre is quoting the first line of a famous poem, The Tomb of Edgar Poe, by the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, 1942 to 1898. Well, the guy only lived for 50 years. I've quoted the line from the English translation of the poem by Peter Manson. Of course, these various formulas only appear to be in bad faith. They were blah blah blah. You don't think he's as smart as he think he is? As he thought he was? How come? I'll have you know that this guy was one of the, well, he is one of the most famous philosophers in postmodern philosophy, or whatever the fuck. Anyway, let me know your opinion. Explicitly conceived in this paradoxical form in order to make an impact and to disconcert us mentally with their enigma. Oh, you know? Okay. While this appearance is precisely what concerns us, what matters here is the formulas do not create any new or solidly structured notions. On the contrary, they are constructed in such a way to remain as a state of continual disintegration and allow for a continual slippage from the naturalist present into transcendence and back again. Indeed, we can see how bad faith makes use of all of these judgments, all of them which aim to establish that I am not what I am. If I was only what I am, I would be able, for example, to think seriously about this reproach someone has made, to search myself scrupulously, and perhaps I would be obliged to admit its truth. But precisely through my transcendence, I escape from everything that I am. I do not even have to discuss the legitimacy in the reproach, in the sense in which Suzanne says to Figaro, to prove that I'm right would be to grant that I could be wrong. 12. Footnote 12. Sartre is referring to the character in the Beaumarchais 1778 play, The Marriage of Figaro. Yeah, I agree that what he says is pretty long and drawn out, and he does repeat himself a lot. He goes on like run-on sentences. But like, you know, whatever. And it was translated from French to English if I'm not incorrect. So sometimes it might be a little convoluted. I am in a place where no reproach can escape, leaving my rags behind in the preacher's hands. Only the ambiguity necessary for bad faith stems from the claim advanced here, that I am my transcendence in the mode of being of a thing. And it is only in this way, indeed, that I can feel myself escaping all these reproaches. It is in this sense that our young woman purifies desire of its humiliating aspects, wanting to consider only the pure transcendence that allows her to avoid even naming it. But conversely, I'm too big for myself by displaying a transcendence transformed into facticity is the source of an infinity of excuses that for our failures or our weakness. In the same way, a young coquette maintains her transcendence to the extent to which the respect and esteem demonstrated in her admirer's behavior already belong in order of the transcendent, but she stops this transcendence there and thickens it with all the facticity of the present. The respect is nothing but respect in frozen movement of surpassing is no longer surpassed towards anything. But if this metastables concept of transcendence facticity is one of bad faith's basic tools, it is not the only one in its type. A similar use can be made of another duplicity in human reality. A duplicate that we can roughly describe by saying that being for itself implies a complementary being for the other. Okay. Yeah, he's pretty sexist, but like, so were all philosophers back in the 1900s or 1800s or whatever. So yeah, I guess it is a product of its time. But I'm still reading so that I can see what I can take from it. It is always possible to make any particular behavior of mine into the target of two converging points of view. I look at it and so does the other. Now, to be precise, this behavior will not present the same structure in each case, but, as we will see later, and as everyone senses, there is no difference between appearance and being between these two aspects of my being, as if I were in relation to myself. My truth and the other possessed only a deformed image of me. The equal dignity of my being for the other and my being for myself allows for a constantly disintegrating synthesis and a constant game of avoidance, in which the for itself escapes to the for the other, and the for the other escapes to the for itself. We have seen the use of our young woman was able to make of our being of the midst in the world, that is, of our inert presence as a passive object among other objects, in order to unburden herself suddenly of the demands of her being in the world, that is, of the being that makes the world happen, by projecting itself beyond the world toward its own possibilities. Footnote 13. For this distinction between ways of being in the world, see the section on Heidegger's vocabulary and notes on the translation. Okay. Finally, let us take note of the Confucial syntheses that play on the annihilating ambiguity of the three temporal ecstasies. Affirming at the same time that I am what I have been, the man who deliberately stops at one stage of his life and refuses to take any further changes into account, and that I am not what I have been, the man who, in the face of reproaches and resentment, completely dissociates himself from his past, insisting on his freedom and his constant recreation. Is that 3? Yeah, no. In all these concepts whose role in the reasoning process is merely transitive and which, like the imaginary entities in the calculation of physicists, are eliminated from the conclusion, we can find the same structure and the idea to constitute human reality as a being that is what it is not, and that is not what it is. But what exactly is required in order for these concepts of disintegration to take on even an illusion of existence, so that they can appear to consciousness for an instant, even if only within a process of evanescence. In this regard, a quick analysis on the idea of sincerity, the antithesis of a bad faith, will be the most instructive. Okay, looking back up here, hold on. The man who deliberately stops at one stage of his life and refuses to change, and the man who refuses to take any kind of criticism, but that's not three ecstasies. I guess that is pretty interesting. It's like people who don't change themselves are kind of like lying to themselves or like in some kind of cognitive dissonance as like, oh, the world, I'm not the one who's wrong, the world is wrong. It honestly, I kind of do have that kind of mentality, or I have been stuck in that mentality for a while, but whatever. Like of blaming everyone but yourself will be more instructive. In effect, sincerity presents itself in demand and in consequence. It is not a state. However, is the ideal to be attained in this case? Well, again, drink some water. Okay. It is that man should be for himself only what he is. In brief, that he should fully and uniquely be what he is. But isn't that exactly our definition of the in itself, or alternatively, the principle of identity? In positing that the being of things is an ideal, must we not admit at the same time that this being does not belong to human reality, and that the principle of identity, far from being a universal axiom, is no more than a synthetic principle, whose universality is merely regional. Thus, in order for the concepts of bad faith to be able to deceive us, even for a moment, for the candor of the pure in heart, Gide Kessel, 2014, to work as an ideal for human reality, it must be the case that human reality is not necessarily what it is, and it can be what it is not. What does that mean? Okay, let's go footnote 14. Sartre alludes here to Les Cœurs Purs, translated into English as The Pure in Heart, a collection of 3 stories published in 1928 by the French author Joseph Kessel. If man is what he is, bad faith is forever impossible, and candor ceases to be his ideal and becomes instead his being. But it is the case that man is what he is, and in general, how one can be what one is, when one's way of being is to be conscious of being. If candor or sincerity is a universal value, it follows that its maxim, one should be what one is not only a regulative principle for the judgments and concepts I may use to express what I am. It states that not only an ideal for knowledge, but an ideal, an ideal for being. What it proposes as the paradigm of beings is being's absolute self-adequation. Footnote 15. The term adequation is less common in English philosophical writing than adequation is in French, but I use it because Sartre's phrase is far from everyday French. Aquinas just defines truth as adequato intellectus et re, which means the adequation of the intellect and thing. Okay. So we should make ourselves be what we are. But then what are we? If we are constantly obliged to make ourselves be what we are, if our mode of being is that of having to be what we are, consider this cafe waiter. His movements are animated and intent, a bit too precise, a bit too quick. He approaches the customers with a bit too much animation. He leans forward a bit too attentively his voice and his eyes expressing an intent and interest in the customer's order as a bit too solicitous. Finally, here he is on his way back, attempting in his attitude to imitate the inflexible exactitude of some kind of automaton while carrying his tray with the reckless characteristic of a tightrope walker. However, holding it in a constantly unstable and constantly disrupted equilibrium, which he constantly restores with a light movement of his arm and hand. His behavior throughout strikes us as an act. He concentrates on his successive movements as they were mechanisms, each one governing the other. His facial expression and even his voice seem to be mechanical. He adopts the pitiless nimbleness and rapidity of things. He is playing, amusing himself. But what then is he playing at? One does not watch him for long to realize he is playing at being a cafe waiter. Nothing in this should surprise us. Play is a type of research and investigation. The child plays with his body to explore it, to take stock of it. Pause. The cafe waiter plays with his condition in order to actualize it. The obligation is imposed in the same way on all shopkeepers. Their condition is entirely ceremonial. The public demands us to actualize it as a ceremony. There is the dance of the grocer, the tailor, the auctioneer, through which they try to persuade their customers that they are nothing more than a grocer, an auctioneer, a tailor. A grocer who dreams is offensive to the buyer because he is no longer completely a grocer. Etiquette requires him to contain himself in his grocer's function, as the soldier standing to attention makes him a soldier thing, who looks straight ahead of him but sees nothing, whose gaze is no longer meant for seeing. Because it is not the interest of the moment but the regulations that determine the spot he must focus on. Eyes, fixed distance of 10 paces. We can see how many measures exist to imprison man in what he is. It is as if we have lived in the constant fear that he might escape from, that he might burst out and suddenly elude his condition. But that is because symmetrically from inside the cafe, waiter cannot immediately be a cafe waiter in the sense in which this inkwell is an inkwell, in which the glass is a glass. It is not that he is unable to perform reflective judgments of the concepts about his condition. He knows full well what it means, the obligation to get up at 5 o'clock, to sweep the floor of his premises before the rooms are opened, to get the copy machine going, etc. He knows that the rights that come with it, the right to a tip, trade union rights, etc. But all these concepts and judgment refers to something transcendent. These are abstract possibilities, rights, and duties according to a legal subject, and it's precisely this person that I have to be and I'm not. Okay, let me think about this for a minute, and let me look up the word candor. It's like, right now I am a streamer, right? So people expect certain things of me, like to turn on the stream and say hello and talk to the chat. And in that way, but it's actually different from a thing because, they're expecting me to show some of my personality. But as a grocery shopper or a worker, you're not really expected to show any of that. And people even find it offensive when you show your real personality, which is kind of like, when you're working in a grocery store and you like sit down to take a break, people go like, "Oh, hardly working," or "Look at lazy bones over here," or "Get me my shit." They like don't see you as human. They see you as a employee, which is kind of how humans or people like what you call it. I keep using the word cognitive dissociation. I don't even know if I'm using it right, but it's like they kind of like separate you as a human. You're not a human when you're working. Only when you're off the clock you're human. Anyway, at least that's my opinion of this passage. It's a little depressing. Candor is the quality of being open and honest in expression, frankness, a man of refreshing candor. Okay, whatever. And I might need to get some water. Okay. According to a legal subject, it is precisely this person I have to be that I'm not. It is in no way that I don't want to be him or that he is someone else. Rather, there's no common measure between his being and mine. For others, he is a performance. And for me, this means I can be him only in performing him. But precisely if I represent him to myself, I am not him. I am separated from him. Like an object from its subject. I am separated by nothing. But this nothing isolates me from him. I cannot be him. I can only play at being him. That is, by imagining that I am him, and through the very action, I imbue him with nothingness. Try as I might to carry out the tasks of a cafe waiter, I can be one only in a neutralized mode. In the way as an actor is Hamlet, by mechanically making the typical gestures of my condition as I aim during these gestures. By using them as an analogon at being an imaginary cafe waiter, footnote 16. Sutra's note, cf. La Imaginary Conclusion, translated as Satra, 2004. Okay. At being an imaginary cafe waiter, what I'm trying to actualize is a being in itself of the cafe waiter, as if it were not precisely in my power to confer upon the duties of my station their value and their urgency, as if it were not my own free choice to get up each morning at 5 o'clock, or to stay in bed even if that gets me sacked. As if by the very fact of maintaining this role in existence, I did not transcend it from all sides and did not constitute myself as being beyond my condition. However, there can be no doubt in one sense that I am a cafe waiter. Otherwise, would it not be equally possible to call myself a diplomat or a journalist? But if I am him, it cannot be in the mode of being in itself. I am the waiter in the mode of being what I am not. Moreover, this does not apply only to social roles. I am never any of my attitudes, any of my ways of behaving. A seductive speaker is someone who plays at speaking, because he cannot be a speaking being. The attentive pupil who wants to be attentive exhausts himself, his gaze riveted on the teacher, all ears, and playing the attentive pupil to the point where he can no longer listen to anything. Constantly absent from my body and my actions, I am in spite of myself Valeri's divine absence. 17. The French poet Paul Valéry uses the phrase divine absence in his poem Fragments of the Narcissus, contained in English translation as Farley 2007. I cannot say that I am here or that I am not, in the sense that in which we might say, this box of matches is on the table. They would conflate my being as the world as with a being in the midst of the world. Nor can I say that I am standing up or that I am seated. That would conflate my body with the idiosyncratic totality in which it is just one structure. I escape from being on all sides, and yet I am. Damn. Bars. Okay. Oh. But here we have a mode of being that only concerns me. I am sad. Can we not say about this sadness that I am in the mode of being what I am? Yet what is this sadness other than the intentional unity that gathers together and animates my behavior in its entirety? It is the meaning of this lifeless way I look out at the world, of my hunched shoulders, my lowered head, the limpness of my whole body, but surely I realize in the very moment I act in these ways that I'm able not to act like that. Let a stranger suddenly appear, and I will raise my head, resume my lively and dynamic appearance. What remains of my sadness other than the fact that I indulgently plan to return it soon after the visitor's departure? Moreover, isn't the sadness itself an action, a consciousness that imbues itself with sadness as it resorts to the use of magic in a pressing situation? Magic. 8 footnote 18. Sartre's note, Equis de un theorie des emotions, Hermann, Paris, 1939. Translator note, translated Sartre, 1994. And even in this very example, isn't being sad in the first instance to make oneself sad? So be it, one might say. But even so, in adopting the being of sadness, haven't we received that being? Where it is received from, after all, hardly matters. The fact that consciousness that imbues itself with sadness is sad precisely because of that, but this would misunderstand the nature of consciousness. Being sad is not some ready-made being that I can give to myself, in the way I might give this book to my friend. I do not have the power to take on being if I make myself sad. I must make myself sad through the entire expanse of my sadness. I am able to profit from any acquired momentum, and without needing to recreate or carry it, to allow my sadness to spin itself out like an inert body that can pursue its movement beyond the initial impact. In consciousness, there is no inertia. If I make myself sad, it is because I am not sad. The being of my sadness eludes me. Through and in my very act of adopting it, the being in itself of sadness constantly haunts my consciousness of being sad, but as a value that I cannot actualize, as a regulative meaning of my sadness, and not as its constitutive modality or modality. Might it be said that at least my conscious is whatever object or state it makes itself conscious of, but how can we distinguish my sadness from my consciousness of being sad? Are they not the same? It is true in one way that my consciousness is, if we take that to mean that. Okay, let me go get some water. I'm thirsty. It's really making my throat dry. Pause. Okay. Let me pause the recording. Hold on though, 1 minute. Okay, that's better. Where was I? Mean that for the other, it forms part of the totality of being about which judgments can be made, but we must observe, as Husserl clearly saw, that my consciousness appears to the other from the outset of an absence. It is the object whose constant presence is the meaning of all my attitudes and behavior, and that is always absent, because it is given to the other's intuition as a constant question, or better still, as a constant freedom. When Pierre looks at me, I know without doubt that he is looking at me. His eyes, things in the world, are riveted on my body. A thing in the world, that is objective fact of which I can say it is, but it is also the fact that belongs to the world. The meaning of this look is not, and that is what bothers me. Whatever I do, smile, promise, threaten, nothing can win me the approval, the free judgment I am seeking. I know that it is always beyond, and I can feel it in my very actions, which can no longer maintain the workmanlike character they have in relations to things, which are, insofar as I relate them to the other, no longer for me but mere presentations, waiting to be constituted as gracious or clumsy. sincere or insincere, etc., by an apprehension that is always beyond my efforts to provoke it, and which they can never provoke unless of its own accord it lends them its strength. An apprehension that exists only insofar as it is provoked from outside, and which it is like its own meditation with the transcendent. In that way, the objective fact of the being in itself of the other's consciousness posits itself, only to dissolve into negativity and freedom. The other's consciousness is as not being, the being for itself of its now and its here is not to be. The other's consciousness is what it is not, and furthermore, my own consciousness does not appear to me in its being like the other consciousness. Hold on. Okay, now we're probably good. I thought I heard something. And furthermore, my own consciousness. Now, where was I? Fuck. That is beyond all my efforts to provoke it, and which they can never provoke unless of its own accord it lends them its strength, an apprehension that exists only insofar as it is provoked from outside, and which it is like its own mediation with the transcendent. In this way, the objective fact of the being in itself and the other's consciousness posits itself only to dissolve into negativity and freedom. This consciousness is as its not being, the being in itself of its now and its here is not to be. This consciousness is what it is not. And furthermore, my own consciousness does not appear to me in a being like the other's consciousness. My consciousness is because it makes itself, since its being is a consciousness of being, but that means by me, the making maintains the being. Consciousness has its own being to be, and is never maintained by its being. It is consciousness that maintains being within subjectivity, which means that once again it is inhabited by being, but without it, consciousness is not what it is. In these conditions, what can the ideal of sincerity mean, other than a task that is impossible to accomplish and whose meaning contradicts the structure of my consciousness? To be sincere, we said, is to be what one is. This presupposes that I am not originally what I am, but here, of course, Kant's you must, therefore you can is implicitly granted. Footnote 19. Tu dois donc tu peux. This Kantian doctrine is normally expressed in English as ought implies can. I can become sincere as my duty and my effort to be sincere imply. Now precisely we can see that the original structure of not being what one is makes it impossible from the outset to progress toward being in itself or being what one is. And this impossibility is not hidden from consciousness. On the contrary, it is the very fabric of consciousness. It is our constantly experienced unease. It is our ability to even recognize or to constitute ourselves as being what we are. It is the necessity that requires that as soon as we posit ourselves by means of a valid judgment based on inner experience or correctly inferred from a priori or empirical premises as some specific being, we must surpass that being through our very act of positing, and not towards another being but toward the void, toward a nothing. How then can we blame anyone for not being sincere, or rejoice in our own sincerity, when at the same time the sincerity appears to us impossible? How can we even make a start in our speech, our confession, our soul searching as trying to be sincere, since this endeavor is essentially doomed to fail, and at the very moment we announce it, we have a prejudicative understanding of its futility. In examining myself, my goal is in effect to determine exactly what I am, in order to resolve that I will be it without deviation. Even if that sets me searching thereafter for the means by which I might be changed. But what does this aim amount to, other than that of constituting myself as a thing? Am I able to determine the set of reasons that motivates me, the motives that led me to perform this or that action? Holy shit, man, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Not gonna lie, I have no idea what he's saying in this passage. And my thirst, and I'm already thirsty. But that would already be able to hypothesize a process of casual determinism constituting the flux of my consciousness, as if it were, blah blah blah. Where was I? Okay. Yeah, I got lost. A deviation, even if it sets me searching thereafter for the means by which I might be changed. But what does this aim amount to, other than that of constituting myself as a thing? Am I able to determine the set of reasons and motives that led me to perform this or that action? But that would already be to hypothesize a process of casual determinism, constituting the flux of my consciousness as if it were a succession of physical states. Well, I discover, even if I'm ashamed to admit them, certain tendencies within me. 20. But in this case, wouldn't I be forgetting that these tendencies are actualized within my cooperation, that they are not forces of nature, and that by constantly deciding on their value, I lend them their efficacy? Will I bring some judgment to bear on the character or my nature? Footnote 20, list tendencies. See my note on tendons on notes of the translation. But isn't that to conceal from myself at the very moment something that in any case I know, that I'm hereby judging a past from my present which definition escapes? We see proof of this insofar as the same man who in sincerity posits that he is just what in fact he will be indignant at the other's resentment and will try to fend it off by claiming he is no longer able to be what he was. We are readily surprised and saddened that the penalties imposed by the court weigh on a man who, in his renewed freedom, is no longer the culprit that he was. At the same time, we defend this man to recognize himself as being this culprit. What, therefore, is sincerity other than the phenomenon precisely of bad faith? Indeed, have we not shown that bad faith is a matter of constituting human reality as a being that is what he is not and not what he is? Oh. It is common for a homosexual to feel intolerably guilty, and for that feeling to condition his entire existence. We can predict without difficulty because that this man is in bad faith. And often, in fact, such a man, even while he admits to his homosexual weakness, even while he acknowledges one at a time each particular sin he has committed, will refuse himself with all his might to consider himself a pederast. 21. I have used pederast in the old-fashioned use to mean male homosexual, to match Sartre's use of pederaste, which is an outdated French term with the same meaning. Okay, I don't condone this, by the way. I don't condone all of his words, by the way. I'm just reading the book. I'll shoot the messenger here. His case is always different, and in particular, it involves games, accidents, mishaps. Thus, mistakes are in the past. They can be explained by a particular conception of beauty that women are enabled to instantiate. We should see them as the outcome of an anxious pursuit, rather than manifestations of a deeply rooted drive. Here we have, without doubt, whose man's Bad faith borders on the comical while admitting to all the deeds ascribed to him. He refuses to draw the clear consequence. His friend, who is his harshest critic, therefore becomes irritated by this duplicity. The critic only demands one thing, and maybe that he would show some leniency, that the culprit should recognize his guilt, that the homosexual should straightforwardly declare, whether in spirit of humiliation or assertion hardly matters, I am a pederast. Here we can ask, how is it in bad faith the homosexual, or who is in bad faith the homosexual or the champion of sincerity? The homosexual acknowledges his misdemeanors, but he fights with all his strength against the crushing perspective, from which his mistake constitutes for him a destiny. He does not want to let others regard him as a thing. He understands obscurely but powerfully that a homosexual is not a homosexual, in the way this table is a table or this red-haired man is a redhead. Seems to him he can escape from any mistake the moment he pauses and acknowledges it, or even better, the psychological duration by itself washes him clean of any misdemeanor, constitutes an indeterminate future for him, and allows him to be born anew. Is this wrong? Is he not recognizing by himself the peculiar and irreducible character of human reality? His example, therefore, contains an undeniable understanding of the truth. But at the same time, he needs this continual renaissance, this constant escape in order to live, to avoid the community's terrible judgment. He has constantly to place himself out of reach. In this way, he plays on the meaning of being. In fact, he would be right if he understood this sentence, I am not a pederast, to mean I am not what I am. If he declared, in other words, the extent that to which a set of actions is defined as a pederast's behavior, and I perform these actions, I am a pederast. To the extent that the human reality escapes any definition in terms of its behavior, I'm not one, but he slides towards another meaning of being. He means not being in the sense of not being in itself. He asserts that he is not a pederast in the sense that in which this table is not an inkwell, he is in bad faith. But the champion of sincerity is not unaware to human reality's transcendence and knows, when the need arises, how to assert it to his advantage. He even makes use of it and posits within his present demand. Doesn't he want the homosexual, in the name of sincerity and therefore of freedom, to look back at himself and to recognize himself as a homosexual? Isn't he suggesting that such a confession would elicit his indulgence? What can this mean, other than that the man who recognizes himself as homosexual will no longer be the same as the homosexual he recognizes himself to be, and will escape into the domain of freedom and the goodwill. 22. De la liberté et de la bonne volonté. Such reference to the goodwill here is presumably philosophical. He may well be thinking on Kant's philosophy. He is therefore asking him to be what he is in order to no longer be what he is. That is the true meaning of the saying, a fault confessed is half redressed. Oh, that rhymed. He demands that the culprit constitute himself as a thing, precisely in order to stop treating him as a thing. And this contradiction is constitutive of what sincerity requires. Indeed. Oh my god, how much of this book is left? Chapter 1. Yeah, it's okay, there's 7 pages left. I don't really know what he's saying here. He's saying like the gay person is an object, but in order to not be an object, he has to say I'm gay, I think. Perchance. Who could fail to see the offense caused to the other and the reassurance secured for me in an in an utterance like bah, he's a pederast, and I think I'm losing my voice. La 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 la, hello. Ugh. Oh, or maybe I just need some water. Give me a sec. Which erases with a single stroke of unnerving freedom and aims to constitute henceforth all the others' actions, as if they were consequences that follow directly from his essence. Yet there is what the critic requires of his victim, that he constitute himself as a thing and hand over his freedom to him like a fief. Like a fief. I think that's like a tax for royalty. Or like a marriage thing, like where you give money away. In order for the critic to give it back to him, like a suzerain to his loyal subject. I guess that's like a tax return. While he claims to be passing judgment, and to the extent of that he demands a freedom, insofar as it is freedom, to constitute himself as a thing, he is in bad faith. What we see here is only an episode in the fight to the death between consciousness and the Hegel called the master-slave relationship. 23. The Hegel describes in his fight and phenomenology of spirit. 1977. Consciousness is called on and required in the name of nature as a consciousness radically to destroy itself, as a consciousness while it is made to hope beyond this destruction for a rebirth. Binding of Isaac rebirth reference. Be that as it may, one might say, but our man is using sincerity inappropriately as a weapon against the other. We should not be looking in sincerity in relations of mid-scene, but in its pure form, in one's relation with itself. But who could fail to see that objective sincerity? Objective sincerity is constituted in the same way. Who could fail to see that the sincere man, by the very act of sincerity, constitutes himself as a thing precisely in order to escape the condition of a thing. The man who admits that he is malicious has traded his troubling freedom to do wrong for an inanimate character of malice. He is malicious. He adheres to himself. He is what he is. But at the same time, he escapes from the thing, since he is the matter of the person. Fuck. Since he is the person contemplating it, and since it depends on him whether he maintains it contemplating it, and since it depends on him whether he maintains it in front of his eyes and or allows it to collapse into the infinity of an individual acts, he makes his sincerity a merit. And a meritorious man is not malicious insofar that he is malicious, but insofar as he exists beyond his malice. At the same time, the malice is diffused. Since it only exists deterministically, it is nothing, and since by acknowledging it I posit my freedom in relation to it, my freedom is virgin. So everything is permitted. In this way, sincerity's essential structure does not differ from that in bad faith, since the sincere man constitutes as what he is in order not to be it. That explains the universally recognized truth that by dint of being sincere, one can end up in bad faith. Stendhal would be such a case. Valery said, complete and constant sincerity as a constant attempt to adhere to oneself is by its nature a constant attempt to dissociate from oneself. The act through which one makes oneself into an object for oneself is an act of self-liberation. To keep constant accounts of what one is in amounts to a constant disavowal of oneself is to take refuge in a sphere in which one is no longer anything but a pure and free act of looking. The goal of bad faith, we said, is to put oneself out of reach. It is an act of flight. We can see now that sincerity has to be defined in the same terms. What does this mean? In fact, in the end, the goals of sincerity and bad faith are not that different. Of course, there is a type of sincerity which is not our concern here, that bears on our past. I'm sincere if I admit that I had this pleasure or that intention. We will all see that. If this type of sincerity is possible, it is because man's being, as it slides into its past, becomes constituted as a being in itself. But our sole concern here is a type of sincerity that targets itself in the immanence of the present. What is its goal? To admit to what I am, in order to make myself at least coincide with my being. In brief, to make it the case that I am in the mode of the in itself, what I am in the mode of not being what I am, and its premise is that I am basically already in the mode of the in itself when I have to be. Thus we encounter in the depths of its sincerity an incessant play of mirrors and reflection, a constant transition from being that is what it is into being that is not what it is, and in the other direction, from being that is not what it is to being that what it is. And what is the goal of bad faith? To make it the case that I am what I am in the mode of not being what one is, or that I am not what, or that I am not what I am. Oh my god. I'm making a lot of mistakes, and also, like, this is, like, getting confusing. Maybe it's because but I did get enough sleep. I was gonna say it's because I'm sleep deprived, but I got, like, over 12 hours of sleep today. Maybe even over 16. I'm in the mode of being what one is. Here again we encounter the same play of mirrors. Instead, indeed, in order for the intention to be sincere to exist, it is necessary that from the outset and at the same time I am and am not what I am. Sincerity does not assign a particular quality or way of being to me in relation to the quality of issue. It aims to move me from one mode of being into another mode of being, and my behavior prohibits me from achieving the second mode of being, the ideal of sincerity, and at the very moment when I endeavor to achieve it, I understand obscurely and prejudicatively that I will not achieve it, but similarly for me to be able to merely conceive and in intention to be in bad faith, by my nature, escape in my being from my being. If I were sad or cowardly in the way this inkwell is an inkwell, the possibility of bad faith could not even be conceived. I would only be unable to escape from my being, but I would be unable to even to imagine that I might escape from it. But if bad faith is possible simply as a project, that is just because, in relation to my being, the distinction of being between being and not being is not all that clear. I swear he's writing tongue twisters. Bad faith is possible only because sincerity is conscious of missing its mark. By its nature, I can only try to grasp myself as not being a coward when I am a coward, if my being is a coward and in question in the very moment of its existence, and if it itself a question, and if at the very moment when I want to grasp it, it escapes from me on all sides and is annihilated, the condition of my being able to attempt to be in bad faith is that in one sense I am not this coward who I do not want to be, but if I was not a coward, in the straightforward mode of being not what one is not, I would be in good faith in declaring I am not a coward. Thus it must be the case that in addition, I am in some way that unreachable, evanescent coward who I am not. And we should not take this to mean that I may be a bit of a coward in the sense in which a bit means to a certain extent a coward, and to a certain extent not a coward. No, it is a complete coward, and a coward in all of its aspects, that I must be, and at the same time not be. Thus, bad faith requires, in this case, that I am not what I am. That is, an imponderable difference separates being from non-being, in the mode of being that belongs to human reality. But bad faith does not confine itself to refusing the qualities I possess, or to failing to see that the being that I am, it also tries to constitute me as being what I am not. It apprehends me as being positively courageous when I am not, and once again, that is possible only if I am what I am not. That is, only if the non-being in me lacks being, even in its capacity as non-being. Of course, it is necessary that I should not be courageous, otherwise bad faith would not be in bad faith. But in addition, my effort at bad faith must encompass an ontological understanding that even in my everyday being, I am not really what I am. And there is not such a difference between, for example, the being of being sad, which I am in the mode of being what I am, and the not being of the not being courageous that I wish to conceal from myself. In addition, and above all, it is necessary for the very negation of being to be to be itself the object of a constant annihilation, and from the very meaning of not being in reality to be constantly in question. If I was not courageous in the way in which an inkwell is not a table, which is to say, if I was isolated in my cowardice, so stubbornly sticking to it, and incapable of relating to its opposite, or if I was not capable of determining myself as cowardly, which is to say, negating any courage in relation to myself, and thereby escaping from my cowardice at the very moment in which I posit it, or if it was not necessarily impossible for me to coincide with my not being courageous, just as with my being cowardly, any project of bad faith would be ruled out. Thus, in order for bad faith to be possible, it is necessary that sincerity itself should be in bad faith. The condition of possibility of bad faith is that human reality, in its most proximate being, is the eternal structure of the pre-reflexive cogito, should be what it is not, and not what it is to be. Hold on. What is it? 13 to 17. It's like 3 more pages, right? Okay, let me get a drink of water, and then we can round this part off. Okay. That is one yummy water. Oh, I might need to drink some more. Only so dry. Okay. Part 3. The faith of bad faith. But so far, we have only pointed out the conditions that make bad faith conceivable, the structures of being that make it possible to form the concepts used by bad faith. We cannot limit ourselves to these considerations. We have not yet distinguished bad faith from lying. The ambiguous concepts that we have described could doubtless be put to use by a liar to confound its interlocutor, even though their ambiguity. 24. Let's read footnote 24. Les concepts amphiboliques in cor que leur amphibolie. Sartre's term amphibolique is more precise than in meaning than ambiguous, which translates as ambigu, but there is no corresponding English term of comparable precision. I use ambiguous here, as Liter explains, while ambigu applies to a word or sentence that has more than one meaning. Amphibolique appears to a construction whose meaning is uncertain. In any case, cases where the grammar makes it possible to interpret a sentence in either of two ways. The French regards such sentences as linguistically deficient. Being founded in man's being and not some empirical circumstance ought to be apparent for everyone. Clearly, the real problem of bad faith arises from the fact that bad faith is faith. It cannot consist either in a cynical lie or anything evident. If evidence means the possession of an object in intuition, but we can give the name belief to the union of being with its object, where the object is either not given or given indistinctly, the bad faith will count as belief. And the problem of bad faith is essentially a problem of belief. How can one believe in bad faith in concepts which have been deliberately forged for the purpose of persuading oneself? We must note that, in effect, the projection of bad faith must itself be in bad faith. I am not in bad faith only when my endeavor is over, when I have constructed my ambiguous concepts and persuaded myself. To tell you the truth, I have not persuaded myself insofar as I ever could be persuaded. I always have been, and it was necessary at the very moment when I was about to put myself in bad faith, to me to be in bad faith in relation to the inclination itself, and to represent it to myself as bad faith would have been cynical. To sincerely believe it to be innocent would have been good faith. The decision to be in bad faith dares not speak with its name. It believes, and it does not believe, that it is in bad faith. And from the moment bad faith arises, the decision entirely determines one's subsequent attitude, and in a way, the Weltanschauung of bad faith, for bad faith does not retain the norms and criteria of truth that are accepted by the critical thinking of bad faith. Effectively and from the outset, bad faith determines the nature of truth. Alongside bad faith, a truth appears, a method of thinking, a type of being possessed by objects, the ontological characteristic of this world of bad faith, in which the subject immerses himself in, is that in it being is what it is not and not what it is. In consequence, a particular type of evidence appears, non-persuasive evidence. Bad faith apprehends facts that are evident, but is resigned to in advance not to be fulfilled by such evidence. Footnote 25. Resigné à ne pas être rempli par ces évidences. Although fulfilled sounds a little odd in the sentence, it is necessary to retain the Husserlian vocabulary used here. Not to be persuaded and transformed into good faith. The person in bad faith becomes humble and modest. He is aware, he says, that faith is a decision, and thus, and that after each intuition one is obliged to determine what is and to will it. Thus, in its basic project, from the moment it arises, bad faith determines the precise nature of its requirement. It becomes visible in its entirety in its resolution not to ask for too much, to consider itself satisfied when it is poorly persuaded, to force through, by means of a bad decision, its adherence to uncertain truths. This primary project of bad faith is a decision, in bad faith, about the nature of faith. This must be understood not as a reflective and voluntary decision, but rather as a spontaneous decision of our being. One puts oneself into bad faith as one goes to sleep, and being in bad faith is like dreaming. Once this mode of being is actualized, it is difficult to leave it as to wake up. The fact that is that bad faith, like being awake or dreaming, is a type of being in the world that tends to perpetuate itself of its own accord, even though its structure is metastable in kind, but bad faith is conscious of its structure and has taken precautions by deciding that a metastable structure is the structure of being, and that the structure of all our convictions is non-persuasive. Still, if bad faith is faith, and if its own negation forms part of its most basic project, I resolve to be poorly convinced in order to convince myself that I am what I am not. It must be possible from the outset for there to be a type of faith willing to own its own lack of conviction. What are the conditions of possibility that this type of faith? I believe that my friend Pierre has friendly feelings toward me. I believe this in good faith. I believe and have no intuition attended by evidence of these feelings, because such an object by its nature does not leave itself to intuition. I believe it, which, to say, I give into my impulse to trust. I decide to believe and stand by my decision, and finally I behave as if I were certain of it, all within the synthetic unity of a single attitude. What I define in these terms as good faith is what Hegel called the immediate. It is simple faith. Footnote 26. C'est la foi du charbonnier. The French expression Sartre uses here literally means the coal man's faith, and is used in idiomatic French to denote simple or naive faith, the faith of a simple man. Coal. Hegel goes straight on to show that the immediate calls for mediation, and that belief, by becoming belief for itself, passes itself over into the state of non-being. If I believe my friend Pierre likes me, I will see his friendliness as the meaning of all his actions. Belief is a distinctive consciousness of the meaning of Pierre's actions. But if I know that I believe, belief appears as a purely subjective determination without any external correlate. That is why the verb itself, to believe, can refer indifferently to the unshakable assurance of a belief. My God, I believe in you. And to its neutralized and strictly subjective character. Is Pierre my friend? I have no idea, but I believe he is. But the nature of consciousness is such that in it, the mediate and the immediate are one and the same being. To believe is to know that one believes, and to know one believes is to believe no longer. Thus, to believe, because it is only to believe, is to believe no longer. And all of this is within the unity of a single non-thetic consciousness of self. Of course, we have stretched the description of the phenomenon here by referring to it as knowledge. Non-thetic consciousness is not knowledge. Sorry, I should probably take a step back. I'm honestly just like trying to read this speed read to the end, so I don't even understand what they're saying. And also, I guess my throat's not sore, but like, damn, it's too much reading, bruh. Oh, let's think for a moment what he's talking about. It's like if you believe something, then it's like it's in good faith, but if you don't believe, it's in bad faith. Or it's in good faith, or it's in bad faith. You know. Okay. Okay, let's get back. Let's finish the job, bro. Of course, we stretch the description of the phenomenon here by referring to it as a knowledge, not that a conscious is not knowledge. But through its very translucency, it lies at the origin of all knowledge. In this way, one's non-thetic consciousness of believing is destructive of belief, but at the same time, the law of the reflexive cogito dictates that the being of believing must be a consciousness of believing. Thus, belief is a being that puts itself in question of it in its own being and that can be actualized only in its destruction. It is a being that can become manifest to itself only by negating itself, a being for which it is to be is to appear, and to appear is to negate itself. To believe is not to believe. We can see why. The being of consciousness is to exist through itself, and so to make itself be, and thereby to surmount itself. In this scene, consciousness is constantly escaping from itself. Belief turns into non-belief, and the immediate into mediation, the absolute into the relative, and the relative into the absolute. The ideal of good faith, to believe what one believes, is, like the ideal of sincerity, to be what one is, an ideal of being in itself. No belief is ever enough of a belief. We never believe in what we believe, and in consequence, the basic project of bad faith merely makes use of the self-destruction of any conscious state. If every belief in good faith is an impossible belief, a place exists for every impossible belief. My incapacity to believe I'm courageous will no longer discourage me, since precisely no belief can ever believe enough. I will define this impossible belief as my belief. Of course, I cannot hide from myself that I believe in order not to believe, and that I do not believe in order to believe. But bad faith, subtle, and complete self-annihilation does not surprise me. It exists at the heart of all faith. What then does it involve? At the moment when I wish to believe I am courageous, I know I am a coward. And this certainty is what will destroy my belief. But in the first place, I am no more courageous than cowardly. If we are able to understand these in terms of the mode of the of being of the in itself, in the second place, I do not know I am courageous. Such a view of myself could be accompanied by only by belief, because it surpasses the pure certainty of reflection. In the third place, it is quite true that bad faith does not manage to believe what it wants to believe, but it is precisely in virtue of its accepting not to believe what it believes that it is bad faith. Good faith wants to flee from not believing what one believes into being. Bad faith flees from being into not believing what one believes. Believe, belief. Belief, being, and consciousness. This guy uses these words too much. It has disarmed any being of advance, the beliefs it wants to acquire, and at the same time the beliefs from which it wants to escape. By willingless self-destruction on the part of belief, which science evades by moving toward evidence, it ruins any belief that might be opposed to it, which reveals themselves to be only belief. In this way, we can better understand the basic phenomenon of bad faith. There is no cynical lie in bad faith, or any knowing preparation of misleading concepts, but bad faith's most basic act is to flee from something it is possible to flee from. To flee from which one? From what one is. Now, the very project of flight reveals to bad faith an internal disintegration at the heart of being, and thus disintegration is what it wants to be. In fact, the two immediate attitudes that we can take up in relation to our being are both conditioned by the very nature of our being. In its immediate relation with the in itself, good faith seeks to flee from the eternal disintegration. Oh, disintegration of my being in the direction of the in itself that it ought to be and is not. Bad faith seeks to flee from the in itself into the eternal disintegration of my being, but it denies this very disintegration just as it denies its own bad faith, inflating through not being what one is from the in itself. I am not in the mode of being what one is not. Bad faith, which disavows its own bad faith, aims at the in itself. I am not in the mode of not being what one is not. 27. Sartre's note, if a matter of indifference, whether to be in good or bad faith, because bad faith takes hold of bad good faith and slides it into its project even in its origin. That does not mean we are unable radically to escape from a bad faith, but that would require corrupted being to reclaim itself. We call this authenticity. Its description does not belong here. If bad faith is possible, that is because it threatens immediately and permanently every project made by human beings, because consciousness harbors in its being the permanent risk of bad faith. And the source of the risk is that consciousness is what it is and not what it is not, and not what it is in its being. And simultaneously, in the light of these observations, we can now begin an ontological study of consciousness, not as the totality of human being, but as its instantaneous kernel. Okay, whatever the fuck that means. And in the next part, we'll be reading Being Part 2, Being for Itself. But holy fuck, that was... Not gonna lie, I did not enjoy that part of reading. I did not enjoy today's reading. Also, it was pretty confusing, and like I didn't really get it. But I guess let me know your thoughts in the comments or whatever the fuck. You wanna watch a TikTok? One TikTok. You guys get one TikTok. When I'm playing VR chat with my thick 6'5" tatted of Futa goth bull girlfriend, but when I get down on my knees, my 60-year-old mom walks in and plugs out my headset, telling me to take a shower, so I chimp out and unleash my hot, unwashed breath on her. Yeah, we all did this. Anyway, okay, thanks for watching. I'm gonna end the recording here. In the next part, we'll tackle whatever the fuck I just said before. Thank you, I love you, bye.